When we think of other countries, we tend to commit two major errors. The first is that we perceive them as radically different, essentially incompatible with the lifestyle and values that we are accustomed to. And sometimes we even refer to them as exotic. The second error is, conversely, that we analyze another country's culture, politics, and whatnot with our own mindset, our values and worldview, ignoring the fact that a different cultural and even geographical environment might have influenced people to have a completely different perception of how life and reality are organized. The two contradict each other, and they stand to remind us that, as usual, nothing is just black and white, and everything requires a deeper analysis. We are balancing on a rope, because on either side there is only the abyss. I'm Kay, and this is Japan This Week. Welcome back. In this week's video, I'm going to talk about the state of Japanese economy and what the government is doing about it. But first, let's start with a much-needed global overview. The war that Russia is waging against Ukraine is having a ripple effect all across the world and has turned the global economy upside down. This is because after World War II, most countries pushed for globalization, that is, the intertwining of all countries' economies as a deterrent to the creation of new armed conflicts. And even though that mindset has created major long-term benefits for most countries involved, the backlash was that countries that decided to recklessly wage war anyway made the whole world pay the price. Sure enough, the two countries directly involved in the conflict were also two major exporters in two of the most important economical sectors. Russia is the fourth world biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas, and together with Ukraine, they are respectively the first and fifth world largest wheat exporters. The renewed scarcity of these two goods has created a considerable inflation that is upending a lot of countries' economies, with some that have already entered a wartime economic mentality, like Germany, which famously ran PSAs on how to survive the winter with limited gas supplies. So, how is this affecting Japan? As for any other country, inflation is hitting Japan pretty hard. Since I'm no economist and I lack the tools to explain this to you better, let's say that in the most simplistic way, inflation is when the price of goods and services goes up. For Japan, one of the things that are driving prices up is the tight global demand for raw materials, caused by the pandemic and the following conflict, in what is called cost-driven inflation. And although Japan's inflation rate is pretty low compared to the US, for instance, around 3% in September compared to 8.2%, this is adding to other issues which are all tied together. For example, let's start from the United States. The inflation hitting the US is different in nature from the one hitting Japan. American inflation is demand-driven, meaning that the consumer's high demand for goods is what's causing the prices to increase. In response to this, the Federal Reserve increased the interest rates in an attempt to reduce the inflation, a move that so far has been widely criticized as useless and, even worse, it caused a lot of problems in Japan. This is because while the Fed is used to doing this, the Bank of Japan is historically reluctant to such moves. Thus, the wide gap in interest rates caused the value of the yen to drop, so much so that in October, the yen to US dollar exchange was 152 to 1, the lowest trade in 32 years. A weak currency is a double-edged sword. It allows countries to boost exports profits by selling at low prices, but it also increases the cost of importing. And for a resource-scarce nation such as Japan, this is proving to be indeed a bad trade-off. The low prices aren't even encouraging tourists to come back, with the cabinet expecting tourism to go back to pre-pandemic level in 2025, all the while sinking one of the most profitable sectors for the Japanese economy. To counter all this, the Japanese government is enacting various questionable strategies. In order to avoid raising the interest rates, the BOJ is performing a series of so-called stealth interventions in buying currency and selling dollar to keep the yen's value from falling even more. Stealth, meaning that the BOJ is not announcing when such maneuvers take place, in order to contrast speculators and keep them guessing on other possible interventions. The last announced purchase happened on September 22nd for a value of 2.83 trillion yen, around $19.46 billion. But it was quite ineffective and was followed by another one on October 21st and likely one more on October 24th. These interventions caused the yen to go back to 146 against the dollar, but this is far from being the normality. The BOJ is avoiding the hike in interest rates in an attempt to create a virtuous cycle of raising wages and more investments. But because of the US's Federal Reserve moves and the inherent differences between the two countries, that could be a long time coming. You have to understand that Japan's labor market and work culture are radically different from the ones in the US. If, in the latter, workers increase their wages by typically switching jobs, in Japan that's historically considered proof that that worker is unreliable, not trustworthy. And therefore, the most common way to increase one's salary is through seniority. But obviously, given the current situation, waiting years for your salary to increase is not a viable solution. In response to this dire situation for Japanese households, strangled between the weak yen and inflation, on Tuesday, Kishida's government approved to spend an extra 29 trillion yen with the intent to reduce utility bills and increase reserve funds. This move, while remarkable in scope, will be mostly achieved through debt, by issuing bonds for around 23 trillion yen, with the BOJ already owning over 40% of the government debt. And it's not over yet. On top of this, there are two other major problems. One is a possible industry crisis tied to electric vehicles, given the recent moves by the American administration and the structure of the Japanese automotive industry, a major source of revenue for the country. This video is already long enough, so if you're interested, we can talk about that in the future. The other major issue is the impending energetic crisis. I'll be brief, but given the international situation Russia created by so recklessly invading Ukraine, gas prices everywhere have skyrocketed. This is because Russia is the first natural gas exporter in the whole world, and now that it's at war, it decided to use that as a weapon to gain diplomatic leverage, so far failing miserably. All the economies that were relying on Russian gas have seen major economical impacts, like most European countries. And while many are shifting their attention to exporters like Qatar and Algeria, Japan recently announced it won't bail out of gas deals with Russia. Japan relies on Russia for about 9% of its gas imports, which come almost entirely from the Sakhalin II plant. Sakhalin is an island between the northwest part of Japan and Russia, and it has long been a contested area between the two, along with the Kuril Islands. After it was divided in two areas of influence at the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, in the final days of World War II, Russia seized complete control over it, as well as the Kuril Islands. While Japan still contests sovereignty over the Kuril Islands, it's not interested in claiming Sakhalin as its own anymore, although it has some serious investments there. Various consortia were born between Russia, Japan, and international companies in order to tap the island's major natural resources, oil and gas. Japan has investments in both the Sakhalin I plant through the Sodeco consortium and in Sakhalin II, which is shared by Gazprom, the oligarch-owned Russian energy corporation, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Shell. In 2007, before the gas plant was even inaugurated, Gazprom had taken 50% plus one share interest in the company, granting the Russian state complete control over it. Fast forward to our days, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Shell decided to bail out from Sakhalin and any other investments in the country, prompting Vladimir Putin to sign a decree on the last day of June 2022 that orders the transfer of the Sakhalin II project to a domestic company. And here's the news. Japan is retaining its stakes in both plants. Prompted by the government, both Sodeco, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Toho Gas, and other companies renewed their stakes and contracts, creating a lot of controversies about the moral implications. And not only. The continued dependency from Russia exposes Japan to the whims of its dictator, in a moment when international politics for Japan are already getting worse, with big tensions brewing with North Korea and the relationship with China on thin ice. And while this is, in the eyes of many, a short-sighted move, I'd like to give the Japanese government the tiniest of breaks here. It's clear that the administration is trying to think of its citizens' best interests, along with its own huge economical ones. While it's urging companies to stock up supply for the coming winter, earlier in October, the government issued a law allowing it to restrict the usage of city gas by major companies in a rationing mindset. And all the while, the government is tackling the energy crisis by also tweaking the nuclear plant's situation by modifying the reactor regulation law, enacted after the Fukushima plant incident, that set the lifetime of a nuclear power plant to 40 years, then 60, and now more. The decision to amend the safety rules would make so that the time the plants have been closed for inspections and maintenance would not be counted towards the limit, up to 70 years in total. Limit that the government is thinking of removing altogether. In addition, the Asahi Shimbun reports that the government plans to move the parts of the law regarding the reactor's operation period basically from the jurisdiction of the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, a part of the Ministry of Environment, to the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Industry. Who cares if there is a giant conflict of interests? But again, extending the nuclear plant's life is an understandable move. Russia is threatening the whole energy sector, and more in general, it works towards carbon neutrality, which is incidentally the excuse the government is using. But LDP-led governments have always been fiercely pro-nuclear, and saying a plant is safe doesn't make it so. To be fair, I haven't read any opinions by the IAEA on the matter. I don't think they released one yet at the time of recording. But changing regulations without thorough scientific proof that operating is 100% safe is a recipe for disaster. Let's hope nothing goes wrong and that the situation will be resolved soon. That's it for this week. I also wanted to talk about foreign policy and the ongoing church scandal, but this video is already complex enough, and in all honesty, unless there is some major update on the Unification Church issue, it's all the same repertoire. First Kishida takes a moderate stance, then he reads the new polls that show his approval rating sinking, and then he announces bold action that so far has gone nowhere. Rinse and repeat. Nonetheless, thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe. See ya!